The debris field was wrong. Commodore Sarathvel of the Dominion Survey Corps noticed it first as an irregularity in her spectral array. Not what the debris asterisk was asterisk, but what it wasn't asterisk. Human alloys, human drive signatures, hull plating with the specific crystalline stress fracture pattern that Dominion metallurgists had cataloged from 17 confirmed kills over 3 years of systematic disarmament. The wreckage of the asterisk Usk's Indomitable hung in the cold between stars like a confession. Every reading checked out. Every measurement confirmed destruction. She filed the report. The war was over. She was wrong about almost everything except the wreckage. The last human battleship had died 11 months ago. Everyone in the Dominion knew this. The Conclave had verified it through 4 independent sensor networks, cross-referenced with captured human naval records, and confirmed by the testimony of 31 human officers who had surrendered the Aldebaran line without a single shot fired. They were tired. They were beaten. The mathematics of the conflict had always been inevitable. A civilization 1,800 years old against a species that had achieved interstellar travel barely 3 centuries prior. Humanity had fought longer than any rational projection suggested they would. They had sacrificed more than any cost-benefit analysis could justify. They had lost. The Dominion allowed the surrender because erasure was wasteful. Humanity would be absorbed. Their remaining colonies would be restructured. Their military infrastructure would be dismantled under supervised decommission protocols, and the human officers who cooperated would be granted administrative roles in the new provincial government. Clean, efficient, precedented. The first anomaly arrived 17 days after Sarathvel filed her report. It was not a ship. It was an asterisk sound asterisk. Deep range acoustic resonance detectors, instruments designed to map gravitational currents through interstellar medium, began registering interference patterns that shouldn't have existed in empty space. The patterns were faint. The Dominion's Deep Space Monitoring Station on the edge of the Kepler buffer logged them as equipment drift and flagged the arrays for maintenance calibration. The technician who reviewed the log spent 4 minutes on it, noted the scheduled service date, and moved on to the 17 other items in her queue. Her name was Overseer Dankwareth, and she would spend the rest of her life trying to explain why she hadn't looked longer. The second anomaly arrived 9 days after that. A navigation beacon on the outermost reach of human colonial space, a system called Proxima Tertius that the Dominion had formally absorbed 4 months prior, went silent. Not destroyed, not damaged. Silent in a very specific way. It broadcast its final ping normally, then produced exactly 4 seconds of carrier signal with no embedded data, and then stopped. The carrier signal before the silence contained something that Dominion analysts initially dismissed as static. It took them 6 weeks to realize it was a message. It took them another 3 weeks to understand what the message said. By then, the third anomaly had already changed everything. Subadmiral Prethcon had been assigned to oversee the human disarmament process because he was considered meticulous, patient, and possessed of an unusual capacity for understanding alien psychologies. He had personally supervised the decommission of 11 of humanity's 14 confirmed capital ships. He had walked the corridors of the asterisk Usk's Meridian as its reactors were powered down, watched human crew members file off in silence, noted with clinical detachment the way many of them touched the walls of their ship as they passed, a gesture he had cataloged as culturally significant mourning behavior. They pressed their palms flat against the metal. Some held the contact for several seconds. He had found it sad, in the way one finds a child's drawing of something they will never have touching rather than meaningful. He had annotated it in his report as emotional attachment to non-sentient objects, consistent with human tendency to anthropomorphize material constructs. He had been wrong about what he was watching. Subadmiral, his aide, A young analyst named Varexal appeared at the entrance of his review chamber, and Prethcon noticed immediately that Varexal's secondary breathing membranes were cycling at elevated rate. Stress indicator. We have received the translation of the Proxima Tertius carrier signal. And Varexal set the data tile on the surface between them without speaking, which told Prethcon more than the document did. He read it. He read it again. The message, broadcast from a beacon that should have contained nothing but positional data, consisted of 11 words in standard galactic Creole, the trade language humanity had adopted for interspecies communication. 11 words that, when properly parsed for human idiomatic syntax, translated as, "We never stopped building. You counted what you were allowed to see." Prethcon set the tile down. The chamber was very quiet. "When was this message encoded?" he asked. 14 months ago, sir, before the surrender." Before? He said it without inflection, the way one states a mathematical fact while waiting for the equation to finish resolving. Pull every decommission record for the last 3 years. Every single one. What they found in the decommission records was both reassuring and, in a way that took the Dominion analysts several days to fully articulate, profoundly disturbing in its reassurance. Everything was in order. The records were meticulous. Human naval officers had provided complete manifests, serial documentation, reactor shutdown confirmations, and in several cases had personally guided Dominion inspection teams through the dismantling process. The indomitable asterisk. The Meridian asterisk. The Carthage asterisk, the Themistocles asterisk, the asterisk Lake Gulf asterisk, the Coral Sea asterisk. Ship after ship, confirmed destroyed or decommissioned, every record signed and countersigned and triple verified. The records were perfect. That was the problem. Prethcon had overseen disarmament treaties with 4 other species. He understood what compliant documentation looked like. What he was holding felt different in a way he could not immediately quantify. The human records were too complete, too smooth. Every question his teams had raised during inspections had been met with immediate, thorough, fully cross-referenced answers. In retrospect, the answers had arrived faster than was plausible if humans were retrieving them in real time. They had been prepared. They had known exactly what would be asked. "They knew our inspection protocols," said Overseer Danquareth, who had been pulled into the review after the Proxima Tertius situation elevated the inquiry's urgency. She stood across the table from Prethcon in the Dominion's regional command station, and her voice carried the flat tone of someone working very hard to stay clinical. "They knew what our teams looked for and what they didn't. They filled in every gap." "They gave us what we needed to see," Prethcon said. "Yes. While we counted 14 ships." Danquareth's membrane cycled. "Sir, I've been running the acoustic resonance data through the new filters. The interference patterns we initially flagged as equipment drift." She paused, and the pause itself was a kind of dread. "Their propulsion signatures, modified, heavily shielded, but they match the baseline harmonic for human Alcubierre-class drive systems. The shielding suppresses roughly 94% of the standard emission spectrum." Prethcon went very still. "How many?" "We can't get a precise count. The shielding creates overlapping interference when multiple sources occupy the same volume of space." She looked directly at him. "We know they're beyond the Kepler buffer. We know they've been there for at least 7 months based on signal accumulation data. We know there are enough drive signatures to create mutual interference across a 3 light-year detection radius." "How many, Danquareth?" Her next breath was audible. "Thousands, sir. Minimum. The interference pattern requires a minimum of several thousand point sources operating in close formation to produce this kind of signal bleed." The word thousand sat in the room like an object with physical weight. Humanity had supposedly fielded 14 capital ships. The Dominion had destroyed, per confirmed record, 11 of those in the 3 years of active conflict. The remaining 3 had been decommissioned under direct supervision. 14 ships, 11 destroyed, 3 decommissioned, 0 remaining. Thousands. The Conclave convened in emergency session within 40 hours. Preth Khan attended via long-range link, his image present among the assembled commanders of the Dominion's military establishment, 31 senior officers representing every major arm of the greatest interstellar power in the known galaxy. They had never lost a war. They had never faced a situation where a formally surrendered civilization had continued building military assets during the surrender process on a scale that exceeded their entire pre-war production. High Arbiter Tessavain Korath, who led the session, was the oldest commander in the room and the least easily rattled. She had overseen the absorption of 6 civilizations. She had, in her career, made decisions that ended the independent existence of species. She opened the session with a question that stayed with Preth Khan long after the meeting ended. When humans touched the walls of their ships during decommission, she said, were they mourning them, or were they saying goodbye differently than we understood? No one answered immediately. We interpreted that behavior as grief, she continued. Cultural attachment, we noted it, we found it poignant, we moved on. She let the silence do work. Were they saying we'll see each other again? The room was quiet for a long moment. We need to understand, she said, what we actually saw during those 3 years of conflict. Not what we believe we saw, what was actually happening. What was actually happening required 3 weeks of intensive reanalysis and produced a document that would later be classified at the highest level the Dominion possessed. Preth Khan read the final version twice, destroyed his personal copy per protocol, and then sat alone in his office for 40 minutes doing nothing visible, which his aide noted in a log entry and never mentioned again. The document's core finding was this: humanity had been fighting 2 wars simultaneously for the entirety of the conflict. The first war was the one the Dominion saw, the conventional engagement, the fleet battles, the retreating lines, the mounting losses, the eventual collapse of the Aldebaran defense network, and the surrender of the remaining human officers. This war was real. The losses were real. The exhaustion was real. The second war was the one nobody saw. While the Dominion had been consuming humanity's conventional forces, human civilization had been engaged in an industrial mobilization of a scale and nature that Dominion's strategic doctrine had no framework for, because Dominion's strategic doctrine was built on the assumption that a civilization facing existential defeat would concentrate its remaining resources on the visible fight. Rational, efficient, expected. Humanity had done the opposite. They had treated the visible war as an asterisk distraction, a costly, terrible, real distraction that people genuinely died in, but a distraction nonetheless. While the Dominion watched their battleships burn and their lines retreat, human industrial civilization had been systematically relocating its production capacity. Not to hidden orbital stations or fortified moons, the Dominion sensors swept those. Deep space, beyond the Kepler buffer. In the cold dark between star systems where Dominion survey coverage was thinnest, human construction fleets had been operating in blackout conditions for over 3 years, building ships that had never appeared on any manifest, crewed by personnel who had been classified as civilian casualties or reported as defectors, or simply never formally listed as military. The 14 battleships the Dominion had cataloged weren't the human fleet. They were the offering, the piece of the puzzle shown deliberately, clearly, in correct proportion, a real sacrifice, genuine loss, verifiable destruction, designed to satisfy Dominion accounting without ever suggesting there was more to count. Thousands of ships, 3 years of building, in the dark, and they had surrendered anyway. Preth Khan had flagged that in his personal notes before the document even made the point. They surrendered even when they had this. Why did they surrender? It was the fourth question. It was, he was beginning to understand, the most important one. I want to speak with him, Preth Khan said. The human officer, the one who signed the Aldebaran surrender document. The name in the file was Fleet Admiral Jonas Carver. He was currently residing in one of the transitional administrative centers the Dominion had established for cooperative human leadership figures. Comfortable, supervised, not a prison in any technical sense. He had been cooperative throughout the post-surrender period. Helpful, even. He answered questions. He attended briefings. He reviewed provincial restructuring proposals and offered suggestions that, when implemented, tended to reduce friction with local human populations. He had, in short, been exactly what a defeated enemy leadership figure was supposed to be. The meeting was arranged. Prethcon arrived without his usual staff, carrying nothing, which was itself a kind of signal, something he suspected Admiral Carver would read correctly. Carver was a human of middle age, which in human terms meant somewhere past his physical peak, but not yet into decline. He was shorter than Prethcon had expected. He stood when Prethcon entered, which was a human formal courtesy, and he waited without speaking, which told Prethcon that Carver had already decided to let him lead. "You knew we would find the signal eventually," Prethcon said. Carver looked at him without expression. "Eventually. You encoded it yourself." "I encoded it." "Why?" Carver was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was even, controlled, the voice of a man who had made a decision long ago and was no longer carrying the weight of making it. "Because a threat you don't know exists is just a massacre waiting to happen. I didn't want a massacre." Prethcon processed that. "You surrendered to prevent us from discovering the fleet before you were ready." "I surrendered," Carver said carefully, "to open a conversation. The signal was the beginning of that conversation. You finding it meant you were paying close enough attention to have it." "What conversation?" Carver looked at him, and for the first time Prethcon saw something in the human's eyes that he hadn't cataloged in 3 years of studying human behavioral patterns. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't desperation. It was something that sat at the intersection of exhaustion and patience in a way that felt almost geological, as if this man had been waiting, not for hours or days, but for something measured in the drift of stone. "The one," Carver said, "where you decide what you actually want from us." The conclave met again. Prethcon submitted his report. He included everything: the acoustic resonance data, the reanalysis of the conflict record, the assessment of the hidden construction program, and his transcript of the conversation with Carver, which he had recorded with the Admiral's knowledge. High Arbiter Tessavane Korath read the transcript 3 times. "He said what you actually want from us," she noted, "not what you intend to do to us." "Yes. He's already made a distinction we hadn't made for ourselves." "Yes." She set the transcript aside and looked at the fleet data. Thousands of drive signatures, sitting in the dark beyond the Kepler buffer, not advancing, not maneuvering, not broadcasting any kind of military signal, just present, the way a vast and patient thing is present. "How long have they been maintaining those ships out there?" she asked. Prethcon had expected this question. The construction timeline suggests the earliest built vessels have been in active maintenance for approximately 30 months. Deep space. No resupply from any known facility. Our analysts initially assumed maintenance logistics would degrade within 18 months without access to established supply lines. And we found 17 human vessels that appear to have stripped themselves for parts, cannibalized their own hulls to sustain the larger formation. He paused. Our analysts described the maintenance state of the fleet as exceptional, better than expected, in some cases better than ships that remained in active port. Tessavane Korath was quiet for a long moment. Around the table, 30 other commanders processed the same information with varying visible reactions. One of them, Fleet Master Dorvathprin, the most experienced combat commander in the room, leaned forward. "They ate 17 of their own ships," Dorvathprin said. to keep thousands operational. The crew of those 17 vessels redistributed to the rest of the fleet, yes. They told the crews of those ships they were being destroyed. The crews volunteered, Prethcon said. Per every communication intercept we have recovered from that period, the officers asked for volunteers. They had more than they needed. They had to turn people away. The room absorbed this. Turn people away, Dorvathprin repeated slowly, as if the words required physical space to land. Volunteers to have their ship stripped for parts. Volunteers to continue serving on reduced crew allocation. Volunteers to spend 30 months in deep space with no communication, no resupply, no confirmed timeline. Our psychologists have reviewed the intercepts. Prethcon heard his own voice take on a quality he didn't fully recognize. They found no detectable coercion, no indication of any significant resistance. Human crew logs from that period describe the conditions in terms that our translation matrices initially parsed as dramatized or propagandistic, but cross-reference analysis suggests they were reporting accurately. What terms? Tessivaincorath asked. Prethcon had the specific quotes ready. He had read them enough times that he no longer needed the file. One crew member described the experience as the most important thing I'll ever be part of. He looked at the High Arbiter. A different crew member who had been on station for 26 months at the time of writing wrote, I keep thinking about my daughter. She's 7 now. She'll be 10 before I see her again. I keep thinking that the version of me she meets when this is over will be exactly the kind of father she deserves because this is the thing I'll have done. That's enough. That's sufficient. The room did not speak. A sufficient father, Dorvathprin said, finally, quietly, in a voice that had lost most of its military register. He said it the way one says something once and does not expect to say again. Yes. The strategic analysis that followed took 11 days. The Dominion's finest military minds modeled every possible scenario. The fleet beyond the Kepler buffer was vast, thousands of ships representing construction capacity that should not have been achievable in the time frame, built to specifications that incorporated hard lessons from 3 years of losing against Dominion weapons systems. The ships were not identical to the generation that had fought the visible war. They were adapted, improved, changed in specific, targeted ways that addressed every demonstrated weakness of the previous fleet. This was the element that broke 2 of the Dominion's senior strategic analysts. Not broke in the colloquial sense. Broke in the technical sense, they submitted reassignment requests, citing inability to produce useful projections. The reason, as one of them stated in her documentation, our predictive models require that an enemy in sustained defeat mode becomes less capable over time. Human military capability improved continuously throughout a period of sustained defeat. We do not have a framework for this. Our models produce noise. Prethcon had been watching human behavior long enough that this didn't surprise him. It confirmed something he had begun suspecting from the first time he had reviewed the conflict data without the interpretive lens of they are losing, therefore they are deteriorating. Humans didn't deteriorate under pressure. They reorganized around it. Every defeat had told them something. Every loss had produced data. Every destroyed ship had been a lesson that their engineers had incorporated into the next design iteration. The Dominion had been, functionally, running a 3-year research and development program for human military technology without realizing it. Every weapon system the Dominion deployed in the visible war had been studied, dissected, modeled, and countered in the dark. And they had still surrendered. Carver, Prethcon said during their third conversation, he had started meeting with the admiral daily. He was no longer certain who was studying whom. Your fleet could win. Could it? Carver said mildly. Our models are compromised by the framework problem your analysts apparently anticipated. We cannot produce a reliable projection, which is itself a projection. The point is that you hold a viable offensive position. You could have launched immediately after the surrender, before we fully absorbed the colonial territory, before we completed network integration. You chose not to. We chose not to. Why? Carver was quiet for a moment in that deliberate way that Prethcon had learned to interpret as careful rather than evasive. Because winning that war, Carver said, would mean starting another one, and we've been at this for 3 years. My people are tired. He looked at Prethcon directly. Not beaten, tired. There's a difference you might want to think about. And if the Conclave chooses not to renegotiate the terms of absorption, then we'll be less tired eventually, Carver said. We're very good at eventually. Prethcon brought this exchange to Tessavain Korath privately, outside the formal session structure. She received it in silence, and he waited. He's not threatening us, she said. No. He's explaining a natural process, the way one explains gravity. Yes. She moved to her observation port. Beyond it, the stars burned with the cold indifference of astronomical time. Do you understand, she said, not as a question but as the beginning of a thought she was working out in real time, what it means that they surrendered from a position of strength? What kind of civilization does that? A civilization, Prethcon said, that is thinking about what comes after the war more than about the war itself. She turned. While we were cataloging our wins, they were designing the peace they wanted. And paying for it, in full, in advance. He thought of the crew member's log entry, the daughter who would be 10 before she saw her father. The volunteers turned away from their own destruction because there were too many of them. They absorbed 3 years of losses. They sacrificed the visible fleet. They spent 30 months in the dark maintaining ships they hoped they wouldn't need. All of it, was the price they were willing to pay to arrive at this moment with enough leverage to make the conversation go differently than it would have. Tessavain Korath didn't speak for a long time. How many of our absorbed civilizations, she said at last, fought us with their full strength? Prethcon knew the answer, all of them. And lost. Yes. Humanity is the first that chose its losses. He had not framed it quite that way before, but it settled with the density of accuracy. Yes. They lost deliberately, strategically. They controlled the sacrifice. Every ship we destroyed was a ship they had decided to spend. Tessavain Korath pressed her hand flat against the observation port, a gesture that was not part of her species' normal behavioral vocabulary, and Prethcon realized with a complicated sensation what she was doing. She had read the same crew logs he had. She had seen the same images of human officers pressing their palms against the walls of decommissioned ships. She was trying to understand the gesture from the inside. The emergency session that followed was the longest in Conclave history. The debate was not about the fleet. The fleet, as everyone in the room understood, was a fact of the galaxy now, a permanent feature like a star or a void. The debate was about what the fleet's existence meant, and what the Dominion's response to its existence said about the Dominion. Several commanders argued for immediate overwhelming response. Strike before the human fleet could fully deploy, accept losses, end the uncertainty. Dorvath Prynne, the most experienced combat commander present, was the one who ended that argument. Tell me what you think their response protocol is, he said, addressing the room. You launch, they respond. Then what? Do they negotiate? Do they retreat? He looked at each face in turn. Or do they go back into the dark and build more? Silence. We spent 3 years fighting people who used defeat as a design process, he said. You want to give them more data. The argument for immediate action did not recover. The formal renegotiation began 19 days after the Kepler buffer fleet was officially acknowledged. Carver attended as humanity's representative. He wore the same plain uniform he'd worn in every previous meeting, no insignia, no rank markers, nothing to indicate he commanded anything. He sat across from Tessavain Korath and 12 members of the Conclave, and he rested his hands flat on the table. Preth Khan, seated to the side as technical advisor, noticed his hands and said nothing. The session lasted 6 hours. What was negotiated was not a ceasefire, not a surrender reversal, not a formal alliance. It was something the Dominion's legal framework didn't have precise terminology for, something that the human diplomatic team had apparently come prepared with extensive documentation on, including 17 precedents from human history alone, which was 300 years old. Humanity had apparently done this before, with itself. The agreement that emerged could be summarized in the most reductive terms as coexistence as equals, with binding arbitration framework, mutual recognition of territorial sovereignty, and a joint commission for any future dispute. What the Conclave Strategic Committee summarized it as in their internal documentation was harder to fit into formal language. The closest equivalent in Dominion political vocabulary translated roughly as, they insisted on being treated as a civilization rather than a conquest, and we discovered that our alternative was worse. Preth Khan's private summary, which he wrote once and kept, was shorter than either. They paid full price for the table, then they sat down. The Kepler buffer fleet returned to human space over the following 6 weeks. Preth Khan watched the sensor data as thousands of drive signatures resolved, moved, and dispersed. The ships were real. The design adaptations were real. The 30 months of maintenance in the dark were real in the way that something only becomes real when you see its physical consequences. Hull plating worn smooth by sustained deep space exposure. Power systems recalibrated at the component level by crew members who had spent months with no access to standard facilities. Weapons systems upgraded using innovations developed in conditions that Dominion engineers, reviewing the captured data later, described with a word that was very close to the Dominion equivalent of *impossible*. One of those engineers, a senior systems analyst named V. Hethorin, submitted a formal report on the weapons systems and attached a personal addendum that her supervisors chose not to remove before filing. The addendum said, "I have reviewed the modification records. The crew did this work, not automated systems, not specialized teams. The crew, in rotation, across 30 months, in conditions that our occupational psychology models indicate should have produced a complete breakdown of maintenance discipline within 8 months. I don't have an explanation that fits the model. I think the model is wrong." Preth Khan read that addendum and thought of something Carver had said in their 4th meeting, almost offhandedly, as if it were common knowledge. "The thing that keeps people going," Carver had said, "isn't certainty. We're not built for certainty. We're built for *purpose*. Give a human a reason that's bigger than their fear and they'll maintain a weapons system in the dark for 3 years with their bare hands. Take the reason away and they'll stop in comfortable surroundings in a week." He had paused, then added, almost quietly, "We've always known that about ourselves. We just don't always remember to tell other people." The galaxy did not change overnight. The Dominion remained the dominant power in the known region of space. Human civilization remained smaller, younger, less resourced, less established. The agreement that emerged from the renegotiation was binding, but binding things require ongoing commitment to remain binding, and that commitment would be tested. Preth Khan had no illusions about this. The political currents of an 1800-year empire did not redirect in a single session. But something had changed that could not be unchanged. Every species the Dominion had absorbed, the Conclave had treated the same way as a calculation. Input, output, cost, yield. Humanity had refused to be a calculation. They had introduced a variable the Dominion's institutional logic had no category for. A civilization that treated its own suffering as an investment rather than a cost, that planned for centuries while fighting in years, that built in darkness and surrendered in daylight, and arrived at a negotiating table as something the Dominion had never faced before. Not a conquered people. A people who had chosen exactly how much they would give up and save the rest. Preth Khan filed his final report on the matter and closed the file. He sat for a while with the observation port in front of him, looking at nothing in particular except the stars, which were the same stars they had always been, neutral, indifferent to outcomes. He thought about Carver's daughter, who was 10 now, or would be soon. He thought about the crew members who had turned away from the opportunity to have their ship destroyed for parts. He thought about the 17 ships that had been stripped to the bone so thousands could survive. He thought about palms pressed flat against metal walls, and what it meant when the gesture wasn't grief. He thought about all the things the Dominion had observed, had recorded, had annotated as asterisk consistent with expected behavior, and how almost none of it had been what they thought it was. A knock at the door, his aide. "Sub-Admiral, the human ambassador has submitted a follow-on proposal for the Joint Commission. He is requesting your presence at the preliminary review." "I'll be there shortly," Preth Khan said. He remained where he was for another moment. He was thinking about something Carver had said at the very end of their last official meeting, just before the formal sessions began. Preth Khan had asked, finally, the question he had been carrying since the Proxima Tertius signal. How long had this been planned? The whole architecture of it, the two-war strategy, the hidden construction, the surrender, the message, the patience. Carver had looked at him with that geological quality that Preth Khan still didn't have a proper taxonomic category for. "We knew you were coming," Carver said, "about 7 years before you arrived. We had a lot of time to think." 7 years? "We're not the fastest species in the galaxy," Carver said. "We're not the strongest. We don't live the longest. We don't have the biggest ships or the most advanced drives or the deepest institutional memory." A brief pause. "But we are extremely good at deciding what something is worth. And once we've decided," he stopped. Let the end of the sentence go unspoken. Preth Khan had understood without the words, had felt in the space where the words weren't, the full mass of what Carver was describing, a species that had looked at the cost of its own survival, its own dignity, its own future across generations, and had said, "Yes, we'll pay that. Whatever that costs across however many years in whatever darkness is required. We'll pay it and we'll remember why we're paying it and we won't stop." That was the thing the Dominion had missed. Not the ships, not the weapons upgrades, not the construction program in the dark. The asterisk willingness. The comprehensive, transgenerational, deeply ordinary willingness of ordinary human beings to spend 30 months in the cold dark of deep space away from their children, maintaining weapon systems with their hands, eating rationed food, sleeping in rotating shifts, doing it again tomorrow because they had decided what it was for, and that decision had settled in them like stone. The Dominion had cataloged 14 battleships and missed the thing that made the difference. The ships were hardware. The willingness was the actual weapon, the one that couldn't be destroyed or decommissioned or formally surrendered, the one that had been building in the dark long before the first keel was laid, the one that was still there, fully operational, in the eyes of every human officer who had walked off their ships and touched the walls and gone quietly into the administrative centers, and waited with the patience of people who understood the difference between stopping and pausing. Preth Khan stood, straightened his collar, walked toward the door. Behind him, the observation port looked out at stars that had witnessed 1,800 years of Dominion certainty. They had also, recently, witnessed 3 years of human darkness.